This episode was brought to you by Resilient Nutrition. Pals, greetings and welcome to 2021. Welcome to the first episode of Everything Endurance in 2021. I guess we're a bit late in January now for me to wish you a happy new year, but tough, I'm going to do it anyway. Happy New Year. I hope you had a happy new year. I hope you managed to glean something decent out of Christmas. Lord knows we all needed a bit of a break. But yes, here's to a happy 2021 as well, and to the adventures that are no doubt lying ahead when we get through all this nonsense. You'll have noticed something different about the podcast straight away, no doubt. Right at the very beginning there, tucked in at the start, we've made some new friends, which is nice. It's something we've been working on quite a lot over the past few months, what with us being deprived of the usual international events that we're arranging. What we have been working on is making new friends and connections and building up the Beyond the Ultimate store. We get, through the whole lifetime of the podcast, really, we've been approached by quite a lot of companies that want to work with us and want to get involved, but we've never necessarily been keen on that. And, you know, we're very fussy about who our friends are, but we had a few conversations with these guys and found that we had an awful lot in common, and we really liked the stuff that they gave us to try out. That's Resilient Nutrition. They're our new friends. And if you head over to the BTU store, you're going to find a bunch of their products in there. What you're going to find in there is a range of elite long-range fuels, okay? You are not going to find those products anywhere else. We're the only people who've got them at the moment, which we're super excited about. And they're good. They are nut butter-based products enhanced with supplements that are just exactly what you need to keep your body right and your mind right while you're going through endurance sports, while you're out adventuring, whatever it is you do that you need to fuel for quickly. And they're great. They sit in a really perfect place where, you know, you need more than just a gel to bite the top off and squeeze into your mouth. I mean, they're infinitely more palatable and digestible than the gels are, for starters, but also more substantial. They sort of fill in a gap where you're not going to stop and make yourself a meal, but you need something that's going to keep you going longer and make you feel better over a long period of time than gels, which often just make you peak and trough. And they're just really nice. I mean, who doesn't like nut butters? Yeah, they're absolutely delicious products, and we've really enjoyed them. So now they're our new friends. So Resilient Nutrition is who you're going to be hearing at the start of the podcast. Resilient Nutrition products are what you're going to be finding in our store, and we're going to be talking to one of the founders of Resilient Nutrition on this podcast. More on that in a moment. There's more new stuff in the store, though. I almost forgot then. We made some new friends at Fractel. Fractel make excellent hats for adventurers and runners. And, you know, if you're bold like me, hats are a thing that is very much of interest to you. The ones that we've got in our store at the moment are ones that we've developed in partnership with Fractel, and you'll find our logo on the front of them as well. We're really, really super pleased with how they've turned out. They're really, really good. We think you're going to like them. You know, it might not look particularly summery out there at the moment if you're here in the UK like we are, looking around at the grey skies. But, you know, summer is coming and you will have hat needs. But, you know, getting down to business, let's talk about today's guest. Today's guest is an extremely interesting guy. This is somebody who did a PhD that very much looked at the tight relationship between nutrition, sleep, and well-being. Not just from the point of view of, you know, training with athletes, although he has done that. He's worked with guys that have rowed across the Atlantic and broken world records. He's worked with the US Naval Special Warfare Command. He's worked with elite Olympic sprinters. Yeah, I mean, this guy knows his stuff, but he has a mission to help everyone live healthier, happier lives. And who doesn't want to talk to somebody like that? In 2020, he co-founded Resilient Nutrition, which looks at sort of balancing his cutting-edge science knowledge and the kind of foods and nutrition that runners want while they're out and about on the trail. So we think you're going to find those products really interesting. We think you're going to find Greg really interesting. And today we're going to focus not on nutrition. We're not going to you've heard enough about the products now. We're not going to bang on about that. Greg is an absolute expert on sleep, and we're going to be looking into today in a bit more depth about the relationship between your sleep patterns and your training, about the importance of sleep and why it is so important that we all get good sleep. And really, right now, we're going to be talking about that in a very general way, in a way that's very useful to everyone, because we are living through a time at the moment where everyone's schedules aren't what they were before, where we don't have the same things to look forward to than we did before. We're maybe not getting the same exercise we were before. We don't have the same work routines, and all these little changes, the extra pressure on our mental health over the last few months. Sleep is one of the first things to suffer. So Greg is going to be talking to us about ways of getting your sleep back on track and how that's going to make everyone's lives happier and healthier. So without further ado, I think I've waffled enough. Let's welcome Greg Potter. Greg, how are you?
I'm very well, Will. How are you?
I am very well rested, topically enough. I'm doing good. It's good to talk to you. I'm looking forward to this one. I think this is going to be a really interesting episode.
Likewise.
Well, thank you. I guess before we jump into anything, though, for the benefit of our listening audience who haven't met you before, I'd like to know a little bit about you, Greg, if that's okay. You know, if that's not being overly personal. We're going to be talking about sleep mainly today, Greg, and why are we going to be talking to you about that?
Good question.
Go on, justify your presence on the show, Greg.
So I got into sleep while I was doing a degree in exercise science. I've had a long-standing interest in how all aspects of lifestyle influence our health and performance. And I was at Loughborough University. I did my undergrad there in sport and exercise science, and then my master's in exercise physiology. And it was around that time that I first realized how important sleep and biological rhythms are. And so I began looking for different PhD opportunities in that area and ended up at the University of Leeds doing a PhD which focused on the relationships between how we sleep, what we eat, our metabolic health, so our risk for diseases such as diabetes, and also our biological rhythms. And the more that I found out about sleep, the more fascinating I realized it was. And since then, I do a fair bit of sleep coaching alongside those different degrees. And before that, I've coached athletes from various sports, initially working mostly with athletes from strength and power sports, but more recently through my role as Chief Science Officer at Resilient Nutrition, I work with a few ultra endurance athletes. And I also have some clients on the side, particularly clients who really struggle with their sleep and have some related mental health issues. And a lot of that work focuses on helping people overcome their insomnia in particular. So I'll leave it to you as to whether you should trust what I say, but that's the relevant background.
No, I'd say you are absolutely qualified to be talking to us today, Greg. And I regret if I ever implied otherwise. It's so through Resilient Nutrition, you've now been making a bit more of you've now been seeing into the sort of endurance sports world a little bit more. That's got to be a fascinating area of study for somebody who's done their PhD in sleep, right? We're talking about a group of athletes who seem to have a thirst for monstrously long periods of sleeplessness and seeing just how long they can keep going without it.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And the first work that I did in that area was helping two guys get ready to row the Atlantic in the Talisker Whiskey Atlantic Challenge in 2019, 2020. And I helped my friend Ali, who's my co-founder at Resilient Nutrition, with the preparation for these guys, in particular their nutrition and their sleep. And they spent several weeks at sea. And in those types of events, as is the case in ultra running, it's often the case that people who sleep less perform better. So the question is, how can you best prepare to go through those periods of sleep loss in order to maintain your resilience and your health and not hallucinate too much in this case?
Well, there you go. And I'm sure we're going to get into that a little bit later as well. But perhaps we should start, a little more at the beginning. The first question I've got written down here is, what is good sleep? It sounds like a stupid question, like if you've managed to get in your, 6 to 8 hours a night, then surely you've ticked the box, right? But what does constitute good sleep?
It's actually a really good question. And
thank you.
It's not actually a very easy question to answer, because people will have come across various guidelines. They will have heard people recommend that adults 18 to 64 years old should get 7 to 9 hours of sleep per night. But the reality is that our sleep needs change over the course of our lifespans, but also over shorter periods of time. So if you'd been completely sedentary previously and you start a structured exercise training program, then you probably find that you start sleeping slightly more. Likewise, if you've just picked up an infection and it's not a severe infection, you'll probably find that in that instance, you also sleep more. And that's because sleep has many restorative processes. So what I would say in response to the question is that good sleep is characterized by a few things. You should wake up at roughly the same time each day, feeling refreshed. You should have good daytime function. So you should feel alert. You should feel like your memory works effectively. Your mood should be good. And then you should feel sleepy at roughly the same time each evening. And then you should fall asleep relatively quickly. And the exact numbers depend a bit on somebody's age. And then wake minimally through the night and only for short periods if you do wake up. So those are those subjective sides of good sleep. But what I'll add to this is that it is possible to start thinking more systematically about sleep health as a concept. And many people have focused on the importance of sleep duration. Some people listening to this will have read Matthew Walker's book, Why We Sleep, for instance. And books like that often focus on what happens when somebody doesn't get enough sleep. But that's just one dimension of sleep health. So sleep duration is important, but so is sleep timing. And shift workers, people who are jet lagged, will have experienced this acutely, because if you're trying to sleep at a time when your body's clock is promoting wakefulness, so let's say that it's at the end of a night shift and you otherwise would have been waking up at roughly that time, then you'll find that your sleep quality and duration suffer because of that. Another dimension is sleep quality, and that comprises a few different things. So one is how quickly it takes somebody to fall asleep. One is their so-called sleep efficiency, which is the proportion of time that they're in bed that they're actually asleep. So for simplicity, if somebody's in bed for 10 hours and they're asleep for 8 hours, then their sleep is 80% efficient. But there are other dimensions of sleep quality too. So one is the actual electrophysiological signatures of activity in your brain, which are important to various processes, because we know that sleep is not a monolithic state. It has many different stages, and each of the stages that you go through when you sleep is important to different outcomes, as I know that you've discussed on a previous podcast. And then there's also daytime function. And then finally, the variability of those different things. So one thing that's become increasingly clear in recent times is that if somebody's sleep timing shifts a lot from day to day, then that associates with various negative health consequences. And I mentioned those dimensions of sleep health because each of those independently predict certain adverse health outcomes. So if your sleep is short or poor quality or variable, or if your daytime function isn't good, then all of those things individually associate with risk of diseases such as coronary heart disease. And they also associate with increased risk of dying from any cause in years to come. So I don't want to sound morbid, but it's just emphasizing the importance of those.
I went into this wondering what constituted good sleep, and I'm scared for my life, Greg. I'm going to be knocking myself unconscious when I get into bed.
Yeah, I was going to say, don't you sleep over it, right?
Very good, very good. So it sounds like, I mean, my next question was, so what can start to go wrong when sleep isn't good? And I mean, we've already taken a foray into that. The short answer to that seems to be a lot.
A lot can go wrong. And I know that many people listening to this are most interested in exercise. So it probably makes sense to start there. So in the context of exercise, you can think about your performance acutely. And if we focus on studies that have either completely deprived people of sleep or restricted their time in bed. So maybe they're only allowed 4 hours in bed when they normally have 8 hours in bed. And as a result of that, their sleep duration is effectively halved. Then those studies show that in the case of endurance exercise performance, depending on the study, not all studies have shown the same things, but depending on the study, time to exhaustion is reduced. So if you just have somebody go on a treadmill and see for how long they can run at a fixed speed, they won't go as long. Time trial performance tends to be a bit worse. So if you're trying to run a fixed distance, then you'll take more time to run that distance. And we know something about some of the mechanisms that might underpin those changes. So one is that it's possible that muscle glycogen stores, which are your muscle storage forms of carbohydrate, are reduced after sleep deprivation. It might be that people's perceptions of effort are higher. The rating of perceived exertion tends to be higher after insufficient sleep. And there are probably some other factors at play too. In the case of intermittent exercise, so periods of sprinting interspersed with lower intensity exercise, think of something like football or rugby, we know that sprint performance in that type of exercise may be impaired by sleep loss. In the case of strength and power exercise, it seems to be less impaired than the other forms of exercise based on the research that I've seen. What appears to be the case is that if somebody's doing a really simple strength task, like just squeezing a hand grip dynamometer as hard as they can to see how much force they can produce, then that's probably minimally affected by short-term sleep deprivation. If, however, somebody's doing multiple repetitions of a multi-joint exercise with a relatively high load and they're doing it to fatigue, they'll probably find that they're not able to do as many repetitions as if they'd had sufficient sleep before then. And then there are also motor skill considerations. There have been interesting studies looking at tennis players showing that if you restrict their time in bed, then their serving accuracy will decrease. And people have also done some biomechanical analyses of certain movements. One of them was looking at vertical jumping in cyclists, and they found that not only did people not jump as high, but their coordination was more variable. And that's athletic performance in the short term. But there are also, of course, a variety of other things that contribute to performance over time. So if you think about things that are very relevant to athletes, then one of these would be pain. If you deprive somebody of sleep, then you see something like a 5 to 10% increase in generalized pain.
Oh, wow. So that's pretty significant.
Yeah. And that's likely dependent on the particular population that you're looking at. Another is, of course, infection risk, which is more relevant now than ever. There have been studies in which people have been paid to come into a lab and be inoculated with a virus. They basically get it shoved up their nose. And then they look at their symptom severity in the ensuing days, and they look at that in relation to sleep around the period when they get given the virus. And it seems that people who get less sleep around that time are more likely to have bad symptoms in response to it. And likewise, there have been studies of vaccination responses, again, very relevant right now, showing that if you have poor sleep around the time of a vaccination, your antibody responses to the antigen that you're given will be substantially lower. And that could be clinically meaningful because it could be that somebody doesn't produce a sufficient antibody titer in response to the vaccination, and they therefore have to get an additional vaccination, which when vaccination supplies are limited is a problem. And poor sleep also associates with various autoimmune conditions. And in the case of COVID-19, there's been some preliminary research recently showing that when people are admitted to hospital, if they have obstructive sleep apnea, which is a sleep-related breathing disorder in which the upper airway intermittently collapses during sleep, which temporarily deprives people of oxygen, then they have something like a 3-fold higher risk of dying in the next 7 days than if people don't have obstructive sleep apnea. So of all the different sleep problems that contribute to poor COVID-19 outcomes, it seems that sleep apnea is likely to be particularly problematic. So that's infection risk. Then there is, of course, things like general health and cognitive function. If you're an athlete, let's say that you're playing a team sport, you need to be able to think in an agile way. And if somebody doesn't get enough sleep, then their alertness is reduced, their reaction time is impaired, and some other higher order cognitive processes like working memory and decision making tend to be impaired too. And some of these changes help explain why, for example, people who sleep poorly because of sleep apnea or don't get enough sleep are more likely to have traffic accidents the following day.
Wow.
So there's also risk of accidents. Then there is general health. And if we stay on the subject of brain health, then certain sleep problems quite strongly predict the development of future neurodegenerative conditions. A good example of this is a sleep disorder named restless leg syndrome, which is strongly associated with development of some, they're called alpha synucleopathies, but an example of this is a specific form of dementia. Parkinson's is another example. People with that disorder are at much higher risk of developing that. And also, after a single night of sleep deprivation, you can see change in someone's brain that almost reflect a very small step towards the development of conditions like Alzheimer's, because Alzheimer's is characterized by the development of certain plaques and tangles in the brain. And I'm not saying that those are causative in Alzheimer's pathology, but you can actually see some of those using appropriate scanning methods in an otherwise healthy person after one night of sleep deprivation. So there's that.
Wow.
And then there's metabolic health too. We know that insufficient sleep quite strongly influences risk of things like obesity, but also metabolic syndrome and diabetes. And if we use obesity as an example that's relevant to athletes, obviously athletes want to have good body composition. And when somebody doesn't get enough time in bed, the next day, on average, they consume something like 250 more calories each day, which is roughly the number of calories in a Snickers bar. Doesn't sound like much, but it doesn't seem that people compensate by increasing their physical activity, even though they're awake longer. So the result is a positive energy balance. And if you tally up that 250 calories by 365 days in a year, then that's roughly
that's a lot of Snickers.
Yeah, that's about 11.5 kilos of fats worth of Snickers.
Wow.
So it's quite a lot. So those are some examples. And I don't want to sound like a massive downer, because I realized that I have for the last 5 minutes. So what I would say is that rather than focusing on the negative effects of disrupted sleep, we can instead look at what happens when you take somebody whose sleep at baseline isn't necessarily that good. Maybe they're not getting enough sleep, or maybe their sleep quality is poor, and you then improve their sleep. You see all sorts of beneficial outcomes, both in terms of their metabolic health, but also in terms of their performance. So we can go there if you like, but I'll pause here.
Pause there while I reel about all the terrifying things that are happening to me while I'm sleep deprived. I don't know if I'll ever allow myself to become jet lagged again, Greg. This is scary stuff. And you know what? To put this into real terms as well, you only have to have seen an ultra runner trying to repack their kit on day 4 of an ultra marathon to see how much damage to your executive function that sleep deprivation can do. I've seen people who looked like Navy SEALs on day 1 bursting into tears 4 days in, because their emotions are white hot all of a sudden in a way that they're not used to. Mm-hmm. So there are, I'm talking from a point of view of endurance sports here, because that's the background that I come from. But you really can see the very obvious and very bad effects that sleep deprivation will have. But I hadn't really realized how far-reaching some of those effects are. Like what you were talking about, you're more likely to pick up infections. There are other problems that could happen later in your life as a consequence of this. So I guess what we really need to get into for the sake of humanity now, Greg, is what can we be doing to promote better sleep? Because it sounds like we all really need it.
Yeah, and I think we probably need it now more than ever in the context of this super flu.
Yeah.
Because if you look at how people sleep seems to have changed, then it's difficult to tell And there are different things that you could look at. You could look at data from wearables across the globe. You could look at questionnaire surveys that have been done of people in various countries. But in general, it seems that some people are sleeping better, which is great, but more people are sleeping worse than are sleeping better. And there are some general trends in sleep that seem to be apparent. One is that because a lot of us are now working from home, we have more control over our schedules. We don't have to wake up in the morning for the commute. And because of that, the discrepancy between sleep on non-work days and sleep on work days seems to be smaller than it was previously. So people's sleep timing regularity has improved, which is great. Not only that, but people are spending slightly longer in bed, which if you controlled for sleep quality would be a good thing. And at the same time, it does seem that sleep quality has got worse though. And that can be because of a variety of causes, of course. And examples of those include things like stress because of financial difficulties, people unemployed or people being furloughed. Perhaps somebody's lost a loved one or is concerned about an elderly family member. And interestingly, one of the things that's happened recently is that people are experiencing these so-called Covert dreams. And a lot of people have had very vivid dreams. And many of these have centered on pandemic-related issues. The reasons for those COVID-19 dreams are probably several-fold. One is that people are sleeping in the morning more. And we do most of our dreaming during a stage of sleep named rapid eye movement sleep. And that's so cool because of the way that the eyes dart from side to side during this sleep. And it's also sometimes known as paradoxical sleep because whereas parts of the brain are as much as 30% more metabolically active than during wakefulness, most muscles in the body are completely paralyzed. So it's a really unusual state to be in. But because we do most of that type of sleep relatively late in the sleep period, so shortly before awaking, we're more likely to remember our dreams if we sleep in as opposed to waking to an alarm. And that's one reason. But another is that REM sleep seems to be very important to our ability to regulate our emotions, as I know that you discussed previously on a podcast. And you see this clearly in conditions such as PTSD. Those people often have nightmares and they have recurring nightmares. And the problem is that they frequently wake from a similar stage in a particular dream. And it's almost like a needle on an old record that jumps out the groove each time it gets to a certain point in the track. And what those people need is for the needle to stay in the groove and for them to be able to complete the dream, because it's sort of like the brain's way of being able to make sense of things and cleanse the brain of some of those negative emotions and try and reframe things in a more positive light. So there's COVID-19 dreams. And then other people speak about so-called COVID-somnia. And this is no great surprise when you look at some of the ways in which people are changing their lifestyles nowadays. So many of us are forced to work from bedrooms, for example. And this is a real problem because in an ideal world, you'd save your bed for sex and sleep only. And the reason is that our brains are very associative. They're very good at making connections between things. And what you want is for your brain to associate your bed with being asleep. And
this makes sense, actually. I had to stop working in my bedroom a month or two into lockdown for exactly that reason. It would get towards nighttime and I just wouldn't want to be in there.
Yeah, I bet.
Yeah.
And it's relevant to all aspects of our lives at the moment. So if you think about exercise, for example, then a lot of people, maybe not people listening to this podcast so much, but a lot of people will historically have done most of their exercise at the gym, at least since they left school, let's say. And that's quite easy if you're in the habit of doing it, because most people go to the gym and they go there to exercise and they don't really do anything else. They don't really go there to hang out. So they go to the gym, they walk through the door, and they're basically on autopilot because they've learned to associate the gym with being somewhere that they exercise. When people then transition to trying to exercise at home, they're used to chilling out in the living room and they're used to sleeping in the bedroom. And so now what they need to do is they need to designate spaces in their living quarters for specific activities. So if you're struggling to make a habit of exercising at home or sleeping effectively, then if possible, you need to, as I said, save your bed for sex and sleep only. Ideally, map out a space for your exercise. And if you find yourself working on your laptop in front of the TV from time to time, then you'll probably find that when you sit down at night, at the end of the working day and try and switch your mind off work, your mind defaults back towards work because you've been doing some work in that particular position. And this is also relevant to eating behavior too. For people who are really struggling to control their eating behavior, getting the habit of only eating while sat at the dinner table, let's say, might be a really good thing. Because if you're sat in front of the TV eating, then you tend to lose track of time and you're more prone to eating mindlessly, and that can lead you to gorging excessively. So going back to your actual question, Will, sorry, I go off on tangents sometimes.
No, quite all right.
There's an important principle here named stimulus control of behavior, and this is what I've just been discussing. Certain stimuli predictably lead us to engage in certain behaviors because our brains make those associations between things. And in the case of somebody who's struggling with their sleep, they need to retrain their brains to associate their beds with being asleep. So that means saving the bed for sex and sleep only, but it also means only going to bed when actually sleepy. So maybe you've designated yourself a bedtime of 10:30 p.m. 10:30 rolls around, you're not sleepy, you shouldn't go to bed. Because what will happen is you'll then go to bed, be awake in bed, and you'll be conditioning yourself to associate your bed with being somewhere that you're awake. So there's that. Then if you wake during the night, or if you don't fall asleep within 15 to 20 minutes or so, then you should get out of bed, go to a different room ideally, if not to a different space within the bedroom, and do something relaxing in dim lighting. And that might be reading a book. That might be meditating if you're that way inclined. It could be watching a rerun of something funny but not too stimulating on TV, something relatively lighthearted, maybe a comedy. It could also be something like a sports game. The only issue with TV and screen time is that people do tend to lose track of time, and the content strongly influences how our bodies respond to it. Related to that, another key tip for people who are struggling with their sleep at the moment is, of course, to moderate their use of smartphones in particular. We know that smartphone use globally has increased a lot during the COVID-19 pandemic. And think of smartphone use as being a little bit like nutrition, in that it's not inherently bad, but if the content is poor quality and you're consuming it in excess, then it can have some pretty nasty consequences. And there have been some interesting studies showing, as one example, that if people stop using their smartphones half an hour before bed, then they fall asleep faster. They feel like their sleep quality is better. Their sleep duration is slightly longer. And then the next day, not only is their mood better, but objective measures of their working memory are better too. So it can benefit many different things. So smartphone use is another one that's really important. And then the final pandemic specific sleep tip that I'll mention before I pause is that we, of course, need to do what we can to help cope with stresses. And there are different types of coping strategies that people can use. There are problem-based coping strategies and emotion-based ones too. So in the case of a problem-based one, that could be doing some problem solving. It could be petitioning for universal basic income if you don't have a job right now and you've got no money coming in. But the point is that you're trying to work out what are the problems, what can I do about it? And an exercise that I really like to this end sounds a bit odd, but it's to schedule worry time. And the best time of day at which to do this is typically around dinner time. And as an aside, you'll find it easier to form new habits if you pair them with habits that you already do. So if you do certain things at certain times of day, if you go to the toilet in the morning, or if you prepare your coffee in the morning, or if you have dinner in the evening, then chaining something onto the back of those events is a prime time to form new habits. So in this case, what happens is that lots of us are very busy during the day with work calls, podcasts, and any anxieties and ruminations that we have get suppressed by that busyness. But then later in the day, as we start to switch off from that stuff, some of those concerns can start to percolate to the surface. And because that's happening late in the day, that can interfere with sleep. So the idea is that if you schedule 15 to 20 minutes of worry time, tack that on to dinner, then you can sit down at that time of day, you can list your concern, and then if you want to do some problem solving in an adjacent column, whether it's on a piece of paper or using some sort of note-taking app, you can list the smallest next thing you can do to help rectify that problem. And if the problem is something that's not something you can do about, then you can just list that. The process of listing it by itself is likely to be somewhat therapeutic. And
I am 100% going to try this, Greg.
Yeah, it's really helpful for people who are having sleep difficulties. And it's free, and it's, I think, more helpful now than ever. And the important point with this particular practice is that at the end of that worry time, you say to yourself, not out loud, I'm going to put my concerns to the side for the next day because I've got my worry time the next day. So the idea in a way is that you're just offloading those things from your mind so that you can then wind down and get ready for a good night's sleep.
That's a fantastic tip. I've got all the time in the world for that. I'm thinking about the amount of sort of busy days recently where you get into bed and suddenly that's when your brain's decided that you're going to unpack all the things you were worried about over the course of that day. And obviously that's the worst possible time to be lying in bed feeling stressful and feeling, not stimulated in a good way, but fretful. Mm-hmm. This is a way of compartmentalizing those concerns into a part of the day where you've now got control of that. And I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, and there are a variety of other related strategies that people can use. Meditation is an obvious example of those. Some people find it really hard to make a habit of meditation. And if that's the case, then I'd say start really small. Maybe start with 1 minute a day. At the start of your day, we generally have a bit more control over our days early in the day. And then over time, try and build a habit of it. And some days you'll start by intending to do 1 minute, but you'll just go with it and you'll end up doing 10 minutes, which is fantastic. And you might find that a few weeks later, you've actually got into the habit of doing 10 minutes each morning, which is brilliant and probably enough to realize most of the benefits of a regular meditation practice. I'm not saying that meditation is for everyone, but in the case of anxiety-related sleep problems and pain-related sleep problems, it seems to be particularly helpful. And I also suspect that it's probably great for people such as ultra endurance runners because you're in a way learning to sit with discomfort. And that's something those people are all too familiar with. So I think those types of self-regulation strategies can be really handy. And then there are a variety of other things that people can do to improve their sleep. And I can touch on those now, but I'll pause here.
Well, I don't want to stop you mid-flow, Greg. This is all really interesting stuff.
Okay. So I didn't mention this earlier. I touched on the fact that when people improve their sleep, their performance tends to move in lockstep with that. And as an example of this, while the research on sleep in ultra runners is very limited at the moment and not particularly high quality because it's a really difficult thing to study, it seems that when people get a bit more sleep going into an event, they tend to perform better. It's one of the predictors of race performance, as is, ironically, getting less sleep during the event. So if you're able to get more sleep in the run up to something important, then that's likely to benefit you. And there has been a large number of different so-called sleep extension studies. Some of the early work looked at swimmers. Sherry Marr at Stanford did some of this, and she found that when swimmers went through several weeks of aiming to get 10 hours in bed each 24-hour cycle, they improved their 15-meter swim times. They were able to turn faster in the pool and their reaction times dropped. She subsequently did a study on the men's university varsity basketball team, showing that 5 to 7 weeks of sleep extension improved their sprint times in a multi-directional sprint. Their free throw and 3-point field goal percentages both improved by about 9% as well. And
wow, that is significant.
it is significant. And the players also reported more vigor and better energy. And just as an aside, there's been an entertaining analysis of players' Twitter accounts in the NBA showing that when players tweet during the typical sleep period, their next day performance suffers. And that's not just an average thing, that's at the level of the individual player. And in particular, it seems to affect their throwing accuracy the most. So that has been replicated in a different setting. It's quirky, but it's funny. So,
Wow.
So that's some of those studies. But then other work has shown that sleep extension improves serving accuracy in tennis players. And most relevant to the listeners of this podcast, there was some work by some Australian researchers not long ago that looked at triathletes doing a time trial of roughly 1 hour long. And they went through two conditions. And in one condition, they had 30% less time in bed than normal. So if they were normally in bed for 10 hours, they get 7 hours in bed. And in another condition, they had 30% more than normal. So if they were normally for 10 hours, then let's say that they were getting 13 hours in bed. And after a few days of each of those, they found that their times were about 2% or 2 minutes slower when they'd had 30% less time in bed during the previous nights. But when they'd had 30% more time in bed, their times were about 2 minutes faster. So it seems to benefit performance in activities that are more relevant to most of the people listening to this too. So the point is that, especially if you're somebody who habitually restricts your sleep, getting more sleep per 24 hours is likely to benefit your performance. But what I don't want to do is to have people go away and if their sleep quality is already poor, to then spend loads of time in bed and they're just actually perpetuating their insomnia, because that's a problem. So if you're currently restricting your sleep, but your sleep quality is quite good, you're falling asleep relatively quickly, you're not waking that frequently during the night, then doing what you can to get a bit more time in bed is likely to benefit you. And to that end, I'd suggest a few different things. So one is, if you wake to an alarm, set your alarm as late as possible. Another is, within a couple of hours of waking in the morning, get outside and do some activity if possible. And this is because of the way that our body's clocks influence our sleep. And I won't go into details about our body's clocks, but the most important time cue in resetting these each day is our patterns of exposure to light in particular. And when we get lots of bright and short wavelength light, especially, and that generally appears as blue light, but it's the kind of light that you get outside on a sunny day. If we get lots of that type of light from about 2 hours before you normally wake in the morning to about 2 hours after you normally wake in the morning, then that will tend to shift your clock earlier. So you'll find yourself feeling sleepy earlier the following evening and then waking up early the following day. So if you're a real night owl and that's something that poses difficulties for you, then getting lots of high intensity light early in the day is helpful. And if you can't get outside, then that might just mean expose yourself to bright light via a window or even via something like a light therapy lamp or just bright indoor lights. If, however, you want to shift your sleep later, then you're probably looking to increase your exposure to light in the maybe 2 to 4 hours before your habitual bedtime. You don't want to do it at bedtime because you'll probably just find that that then stops you from being able to sleep that night. But there's probably a sweet spot, something like 2 to 3 hours before your habitual bedtime at which to get lots of high intensity light, and that will help shift your sleep later. But going back to this example, for this person trying to extend the sleep, lots of high intensity light early in the day, get outside in daylight if possible, within 2 hours of waking up. And then late in the day, you want to systematically reduce your exposure to light, beginning about 2 hours before your planned bedtime. Because as the sun sets and it becomes dark, your brain will increasingly synthesize a hormone named melatonin, which is important to determining when you're likely to sleep. So that could just mean dimming the lights. It could mean selectively turning off some lights. Ideally, lights that you have on should actually be quite low in the room, which sounds funny, but it's because of the placement of specialized cells in the eye. And the cells that are particularly responsive to light, that are important to resetting your clock each day, are concentrated in the lower part of the eye. So light coming from overhead tends to most strongly affect them and thereby the timing of your body's clock. So just keeping a lamp on at that time is a really good way to go. and otherwise keeping the lights low. And then during this time, if possible, I'd suggest probably aiming to go to bed maybe 15 minutes or half an hour earlier than normal. But again, you're going to bed if you're sleepy. And this is also a prime time at which to cut down your caffeine intake if you've been overdoing the stimulants recently, as well as alcohol and nicotine. And I'll just briefly touch on those. But caffeine, as everyone knows, tends to interfere with sleep if it's consumed in too big quantities too late in the day. And as a rule of thumb, I normally suggest that people stop consuming it at least 9 hours or so before their planned bedtime, but there are huge differences between people and how they respond to it. In terms of dose, the higher the dose, the earlier you should finish consuming it. And if you want to use caffeine to enhance your exercise performance, then you probably get most of the benefits from a dose of 3 milligrams per kilo or so. So if you're an 80 kilo person, that's 240 milligrams, which is, it's about 4 instant coffees or 2 store-bought Americanos. It's nothing heroic. And I think that on a regular basis, outside of the context of an ultra race, that's probably about as much as I would have someone routinely take in, especially if they're really emphasizing their sleep. Then there's nicotine. If you're not a smoker, which you're probably not if you're listening to this, then you'll find that nicotine is alerting. If you are a smoker and you withdraw from nicotine, then you'll probably find that your sleep suffers in the short term. So nicotine patches can be helpful. And then there's alcohol, of course, too. When people drink, they tend to fall asleep faster, hence us referring to it as a nightcap. But while they spend a greater proportion of the early sleep period in the deeper stage of sleep later in the evening, their sleep tends to break up. And as a result, sleep is less restorative. Not only that, but alcohol is a muscle relaxant. So if you're a snorer, or if you've got obstructive sleep apnea, then your airway is more likely to collapse, exacerbating the snoring or the sleep apnea respectively. So again, I don't want to be a massive killjoy, and I think it's absolutely fine for most people to have a drink now and then. But if you're really prioritizing your sleep health and you're currently consuming quite a lot, then you might want to think about tapering your intake a bit and maybe opting in the short term for fizzy non-alcoholic drinks. And ironically, non-alcoholic beer actually seems to have some weak sleep promoting properties because of its hop content. So that can be helpful in that context. And then that's related to the subject of nutrition. You want to go to bed neither hungry nor full. And I typically recommend that people finish consuming any calorie containing items at least 2 hours before bed. If you eat too close to bed, then what you'll do is you'll interfere with the normal decline in your core body temperature that you see at that time. Because when you eat, your body takes on average something like 10% of the calories in whatever you just consumed to digest and metabolize the food. So if you just had 500 calories, then you'll probably expend about 50 calories processing that food. So there's that. And then that, of course, is related to the subject of temperature. And this might have come up in your previous podcast, but having a hot shower, 10 minutes, 40 degrees Celsius, about an hour before bed, will raise the temperature of your skin. And what that will do is it will actually pull heat out of your core, facilitating that drop in brain temperature that's very important to you falling asleep. So that's helpful. And related to that, putting socks on after your shower and wearing socks in bed seems to help because it helps maintain this proximal to distal temperature gradient. So keeping your hands and your feet warm can actually be helpful for sleep, as funny as that sounds. But
really?
most people aren't going to wear gloves to bed, so keeping socks on in bed is something simple and practical they can do.
Yeah.
And then otherwise, of course, having a wind down routine is key. And that can be part of it. I mentioned earlier, dimming the lights, that's a key component. That hot shower can be helpful. Otherwise, you just want to do something relaxing and not too stimulating. As I said, switching your phone off at least half an hour before bed is likely to be a good thing. Reading is ideal at this time. Listening to relaxing music's great. And interestingly, quite consistently helps people who have insomnia to sleep better. And then you want your bedtimes to be relatively regular from one day to the next. So both when you go to bed and when you wake in the morning. And the good news is that most people are sleeping slightly more regularly now than they were a year and a half ago. So there's bedtime regularity. And then on the subject of your bedroom, and I'm sorry, this is probably one of the longest answers that you've ever had on this podcast. On the subject of your bedroom, you want it to be cool, dark, and comfortable. Ideal air temperature is something like 18 to 20 degrees. It's variable from one person to the next, of course, but that's quite easy to achieve in a country like England, fortunately. And if anything, you might have to keep a radiator on to achieve that. But if anything, it's better to err on the side of having a bedroom that's too cool, because it's easier to warm yourself up by putting on clothes than it is to cool yourself off, especially if you haven't got something like air conditioning, which is terrible for the planet as well, just as an aside. So I think having a cool bedroom is key. To keep it dark, you could use something like blackout blinds. You could use an eye mask if you want that. Eye masks are also helpful for athletes during events if they want to have a kip during an event. And then noises can, of course, disrupt sleep too, especially if you're a light sleeper or if the noises are very sudden and jarring. Some people find silicone earplugs helpful. So that's one option if you want to go that route. And then your bed is, of course, important, and your mattress is arguably the most important item of furniture that you own. And you want a mattress that effectively dissipates heat. And the best ones for this tend to be spring mattresses, because in recent years, foam mattresses have become more and more popular. But the problem is that they're foam, so they're foldable, but foam actually tends to store heat. So you might find that if you've been lying on one for a few hours, then you wake up feeling all hot, even though the air temperature is actually quite low. So I tend to push people towards spring mattresses, and the heavier that you are, the firmer the mattress you'll tend to need. So that's a few more tips to add to your collection, and I'm happy to.
That wasn't just a few tips, that was a full toolkit, Greg. That was amazing. I think one thing that we haven't talked about very extensively there is the effect that your diet will have on your sleep as well. And I guess this is going to be particularly pertinent because often if people are, training for endurance sports, especially if they're going into a training phase, they will change their diet quite a lot. So what kind of effect can someone expect that to have on their sleep if they are, changing into their training diet routine, bringing their calories down, probably pushing their protein up?
Yeah.
What sort of effect can you see that having on somebody's sleep patterns?
Yeah, I think it can probably have quite substantial effects. The reality is that it's very hard to study it objectively because diet's so individual. People aren't very good at documenting what they consume. And it's also difficult to control those types of studies effectively. It's not like you can blind people to whether they're having yogurt for their final meal or kiwis or whatever it might be. And with that said, I think we can probably draw a few conclusions from what's out there. One is that in the case of athletes, particularly ultra athletes, athletes with very high energy expenditures, athletes who compete in aesthetic sports, such as gymnasts, energy availability is often an issue, which is basically the difference between the number of calories that you burn during your exercise and the number of calories that you take in. And when energy availability isn't high enough and people are doing lots of exercise and not eating enough, they tend to experience a variety of negative health consequences, which used to be referred to as the female athlete triad. Now most people refer to relative energy deficiency in sport, RED-S. And those consequences include things like compromised immune function, but also, interestingly, one of the things that happens is that people's sleep deteriorates. If you're an athlete and you've been through a period of either planned overreaching or frank overtraining, then you'll probably have found that your sleep quality deteriorated and you also ended up sleeping less. So some people discuss using sleep disturbances as a proxy of overtraining. So I think making sure that somebody's consuming enough calories is important. And if you're on a relatively strict diet for whatever reason, then you might find that if you're already lean, especially, then your sleep quality suffers. If, however, you're very overweight, then you'll probably find your sleep quality improves, especially if you've got something like sleep apnea, which is in part influenced by the mass of your neck. So whether weight loss positively or negatively affects sleep really depends on the context. But there's that. There's total quantity of food, but then there is the composition of the food itself. And in the case of the macronutrients, My guess is that high protein diets tend to slightly reduce the depth of sleep. And this is something that hasn't been that well studied, but there's some really, really interesting research, which is actually very relevant to ultra runners in a roundabout way. When people eat more high protein foods, think animal foods such as red meat and fish, they will tend to consume more creatine. People will have heard of creatine as a supplement that's mostly used by strength and power athletes to boost their muscle mass, improve their performance in anaerobic exercise, and it also has a variety of other benefits, including clinical populations. Most people get about 2 grams of creatine a day from their diets. If they suddenly increase their protein intake, then they'll increase the amount of creatine in their diet. And this will not only increase their phosphocreatine stores in their muscles, which is how they get most of those exercise-related benefits, it will actually increase the phosphocreatine stores in their brains. And the degree to which it does so seems to be lower than in the muscles. So if you take someone who's never used creatine before and you have them use 3 grams a day for several weeks, then they'll probably boost their skeletal muscle creatine, phosphocreatine content by something like 25%. They'll probably boost their brain creatine content by something like 9%. And the reason this is relevant is that you will have experienced the general trend that the longer that you've been awake, the greater your sleep hunger, if you like. And one of the main correlates of this hunger is the concentration of a chemical named adenosine in your brain. And when you increase your phosphocreatine stores, your body can then take those phosphates and use that to replenish ATP from the adenosine that would otherwise be accumulating in your brain. And so as a result of that, less adenosine accumulates in the brain, and you therefore experience less hunger to sleep. There was a fascinating study done a few years ago by some scientists at Harvard showing that when you add creatine monohydrate to the chow of rats for several weeks, they sleep less, their sleep is lighter, and their sleep rebounds less after sleep deprivation. So they don't binge on sleep as much afterwards. And I know that they've got some work coming out this year showing something similar, albeit at a smaller magnitude in humans. And the point is here that if you're on a high protein diet, you might find that your sleep just becomes a little bit lighter. But in the context of ultra endurance exercise, this can be a key strategy when you're going through sleep loss. Because parallel to this work, there's been a series of studies showing that if you have people undergo sleep deprivation or sleep restriction, and you have them supplement creatine before that period, then they cope better with the sleep loss. So not only are some aspects of their exercise performance less impaired because of the creatine supplementation, and Christian Cook did some work on rugby players showing that they maintained their passing accuracy when they supplemented creatine during sleep loss, but measures of metabolic health might be slightly improved. And in particular, studies have looked at the effects on brain function. So it seems like mood and reaction time and some other things like balance might be less negatively affected by sleep loss if people have supplemented with creatine before then.
Oh, it's bound to be interesting to the sort of ultra runners that are going to be listening to this right now, because that's exactly what they're trying to prepare themselves for, which is the impossibility of, being at the peak of their performance while they're 80 hours on from the last time they had a decent night's sleep.
Yeah, and there are some other things that might benefit ultra runners too. So when people take creatine, they tend to store slightly more glycogen in their muscles, which is plausibly good for endurance exercise. Creatine also has some osmotic properties. It draws water into muscle cells. So if you're competing in the heat, then there's some evidence showing that creatine supplementation can help people better cope with heat stress during exercise. So if you're running the Marathon des Sables, then creatine is likely to be beneficial to you. So all these different characteristics of creatine, coupled with its excellent safety profile and the fact that it seems to be good for general health and in particular for brain health, it's great stuff. And I think taking 5 grams a day is a really easy win for people during these events. And you probably want to have supplemented with it for at least a couple of weeks before the event too.
Well, excellent. That's already covered off one of my questions, which was going to be, are there good sleep supplements to help you get better sleep? And I guess that also touches into, is there any worth in using sleeping pills to promote better sleep?
Yeah, and I'm realizing now that I only very partly answered your previous question about how diet affects sleep, but just to touch on a couple of other things, there do seem to be certain foods that affect sleep. There have been esoteric studies showing that consuming some kiwi fruit might improve sleep quality. Other work has shown that consuming 250 grams of beef tomatoes specifically seems to improve sleep quality. But of the different foods that have been studied so far, the one that seems to be best demonstrated for its ability to improve sleep is tart cherry juice, Montmorency tart cherry specifically. And the way that these have been used in the studies is a bit variable, but a lot of the studies have used tart cherry concentrate, 30 milliliter shots a couple of times a day. And when people take those, they tend to fall asleep slightly faster, feel like their sleep is slightly better, possibly sleep slightly longer. How these tart cherries help sleep isn't very clear. They do contain a small amount of plant-based melatonin. That's probably one mechanism. But the reason that I like this particular supplement for this population is that there's also been quite a lot of research showing that they might enhance performance. And specifically when people use these around a marathon, for example, they experience less muscle damage and soreness during that. So that's relevant to ultra runners. And because of some of the blood flow promoting chemicals in tart cherries and because of some of the antioxidant effects, they seem to be good for metabolic health, but also possibly performance enhancing during particular types of endurance exercise too. So that makes them a really good option for people for whom consuming them is practical. I recognize that they're not necessarily practical for everyone, but I think that consuming them going into a race is probably not a bad option, especially if your sleep's been a bit wonky around that time. There's no real downside to doing so. And then to turn to your subsequent question, there are, of course, lots of different sleep drugs that are used for clinical populations. And they have their place, for sure, especially given that insomnia in particular is often comorbid with various psychiatric issues, depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder, all these different mental health problems. And in that context, if somebody's suicidal, then I'd never say don't take a sleep drug if that's an easy fix and has some small effect on their mood the next day. The problem with sleep pills is that they don't tend to support sleep health very effectively. The type of sleep that you'll get after consuming them doesn't seem to be as restorative as natural sleep. Sleep architecture is quite different. You tend to spend quite a lot more time in some of the intermediate stages of sleep after taking them. And not only that, but when people regularly take them, they tend to build tolerance to them, leading to dose escalation. And they tend to get withdrawal effects when they come off them. So in the long term, they're really not a solution. And in the context of insomnia, when people use something called cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, and we've touched on a couple of techniques that are used in that, in particular stimulus control, which I mentioned, and that cognitive therapy of scheduling worry time. When people use that, they tend to have about the same effects on their sleep in the short term as taking the drugs. But in the long term, CBTI is much more effective. So you're much better off going to either a good sleep health practitioner or just finding an online cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia programs. And one of the things that's changed, of course, in recent times is that a lot of companies have moved to a telehealth model where they're helping people with their health remotely online. And there is a UK-based eCBTI program called Sleepio, SLEEPIO, which has been studied many times and has proven to be efficacious in helping people overcome insomnia. And I myself have used the program. It's excellent. And in many parts of the UK, I don't know if it's in all of the UK, it's subsidized by the NHS. So you can probably get access to that for free. So I think that's a really good option for those people. And if you have other sleep abnormalities, because sleep is enormously heterogeneous. There are 6 broad categories of sleep disorders, but dozens of different types of sleep disorders. And if you think you might have one, then you should definitely seek some additional help. And then finally, going to a question about supplements, if you want me to touch on that, there are some things that might be helpful. They're definitely not a first port of call. People should always go for the behavioral stuff first. But I think when people say only worry about supplements when you've got the rest of the stuff sorted, that's not actually a helpful comment to make, because the point is that the studies of supplements have shown that without changing anything else, some of these supplements are beneficial. So if there's an easy win for someone, why would you not take that easy win? And when it comes to sleep supplements, I think the best ones depend on your sleep difficulties. So if you're jet lagged, then your best option is melatonin during the period of jet lag. There's a website named jetlagRooster.com, which can help give you personalized recommendations about how to best take it and about whether it's ideal for your particular circumstances. But the right dose in that context is probably something like 1 milligram. If you're struggling with your sleep because you're feeling anxious, then something to help calm your anxiety is likely to be good. And I quite like L-theanine, which is an amino acid that's found in tea. The ideal dose, based on a recent review, seems to be between 200 and 400 milligrams a day. Take that an hour before bedtime. That's a good option. I also like ashwagandha, and there's a particular form of ashwagandha named KSM66. The ideal dose is 600 milligrams a day, it seems, based on the studies. And that's a herb that's been used in Ayurveda for many centuries. And it's a so-called adaptogen, so it helps people better cope with stress. And the neat thing about ashwagandha is that while the quality of the research isn't that high, when people who have sleep difficulties take it, they tend to sleep better. But it also seems to have a bunch of other related beneficial effects. And there was a review published not long ago showing that when people regularly consume ashwagandha, their VO2 max tends to increase a little bit. There have also been a couple of studies looking at people taking it while doing strength and power training, lifting weights in the gym, showing that when they supplement with ashwagandha, they gain muscle mass and strength faster. So it's pretty interesting given its potential effects on exercise performance too. And then for general health, I think magnesium is fine. Magnesium L3 and 8 seems to be better at entering the brain than other forms. And the ideal dose is probably something like 200 milligrams of total magnesium an hour before bedtime. And then finally, another context in which sleep is often a problem is pain. And pain is quite mysterious, but there have been some early indications showing that some supplements might help a little bit with pain and thereby sleep. One of these is an analog of a cannabinoid, so types of chemicals that you get in cannabis, named anandamide, and it's called PEA, palmitoyl ethanolamide. And there's a particular micronized form of it that I like called Levagen. And if you take 600 milligrams of it twice a day, then it seems to help reduce pain in certain conditions, in particular neuropathic pain. And it can thereby improve sleep in people whose pain is disrupting their sleep. So that's another one that can be handy. But just to reiterate, the behavioral stuff is the most important thing to attend to. So I'd still strongly encourage people to start with that.
Okay. Well, fantastic. Gregor, I'll tell you, I've learned a hell of a lot from this podcast so far. It's been a really interesting process for me to just sit back and absorb. But I guess it's going to be very, very difficult for us to talk on a podcast that often deals with ultra runners and stuff without getting into the end of sleep deprivation that people seem to love talking about, which is the sort of dire and obvious consequences that it seems to have on ultra runners. 3 or 4 days in, where I had a prominent ultra runner come running up to me once it must have been about 10 or 11 at night. He was 3 days into a race. And when he got up to me, he started putting his hands on my shoulders and then on my chest and even touched my head. And I asked him what he was doing. And he said, "You're the third person I've seen in the last 10 minutes, but you're the first one who was real." He was somewhere else, dead on his feet.
Yeah.
How is it that sleep deprivation leaves you so devastated? And is there something you can do? I've seen ultra runners throw themselves in a corner for a 15-minute nap and seem to bounce back really effectively from it. Why would that be effective?
Yeah. So I touched earlier on how sleep deprivation negatively affects us, but the interesting thing here is the severity of the sleep deprivation. And while scientists could once study people going through multiple days of sleep deprivation, institutional review boards or ethics committees won't actually allow that anymore because it seems to be so damaging. And so all we can really do is look back to some of those early studies that were done. And what they tended to show was that relatively quickly, people do experience different types of hallucinations when they're going through sleep deprivation. And they tend to come in different forms. So one is a visual hallucination, seeing something. Another is an auditory one, so hearing something. And then there are somatosensory ones. So imagine that you can feel a beetle crawling on your arm when it's not actually there. So we have those, and the time course of those seems to be a bit different for each of those different types of hallucinations. But those things are among many different things that do go wrong, and the wheels really can fall off. So the question is, how can people protect themselves against those consequences? As I said before, extending sleep in the period preceding a race is really important. People speak about banking sleep, and I'm not sure that...
You took the words out of my mouth. Yeah.
I'm not sure that it's actually possible to bank sleep per se, because that suggests that you can sleep above some baseline requirement. And I think in that context, it's more likely that people are actually catching up on lost sleep. But the point is that when people do extend their sleep for a period of several days to weeks before a period of sleep deprivation, they tend to perform better during the sleep deprivation. And studies have looked at things like vigilance. So the likelihood that people have attentional lapses or micro sleeps during boring tasks. And relevant to this, many of these consequences that people experience are probably because parts of the brain are sleeping. People think that all the brain might be asleep at once. That's absolutely not the case. And this can manifest in really interesting ways. So an example of this would be somnambulism or sleepwalking. The motor regions of the brain might be wide awake, hence why someone's walking around. But then the executive regions might be fast asleep. And that's true of lots of different sleep disorders that result in some very unusual behaviors and experiences. So there's that, sleep banking in the period before. And then there's the napping strategies too. And when people have been through a period of insufficient sleep and they then nap, they experience lots of positive effects on all sorts of things. Everything from their immune function to their blood pressure, which acutely drops during napping, to measure their cognitive performance, their alertness, their attention, their working memory, to their mood, of course, and also to their physical performance. And there haven't been many studies on this, but Ben Edwards from LJMU published some nice work on this a couple of years ago, looking at strength-trained athletes experiencing sleep restrictions. They're only allowed a few hours in bed, about half what they normally get. And then in one condition, they had a nap at about midday or 1 p.m. for an hour. And then they tested their strength training performance in the leg press and the bench press, and they looked at average force and average power and peak power and so on. And they found that when people were sleep restricted, their hand grip strength declined a little bit, and their ability to produce force quickly in the leg press and the bench press was reduced. But even a 1 hour nap restored the bench press and leg press performance back to baseline. So even though the total amount of sleep that they got in the previous 24 hours was substantially less in the nap condition than if they'd had a regular night's sleep, they could just about maintain. So a related question is, how long should those naps be? And I think the reality is, looking at the literature, that a lot of ultra athletes they will have planned their pre-event sleep to some degree. Maybe they've got certain strategies in place like banking sleep. But then during the event, they roll with the punches. And I think that it's important to do that. And I think trying to too rigidly stick to a plan can be problematic, in particular in relation to nutrition, but in general. So that's relevant. But with that said, I think that the best nap duration is probably between 20 minutes and 60 minutes in most contexts. Obviously, it depends on the nature of the ultra. But if we're talking about some sort of ultra which isn't that long, and let's say that it lasts something like 36 hours, 48 hours, then you want to try and sleep as little as possible, and having a few of those brief naps is likely to be beneficial. The best time at which to have them is likely around the time that your performance is worst within the 24-hour cycle. And that, of course, might mean during the typical sleep period. So if you're normally in bed from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., then at 2 a.m., you're not going to be functioning at your best. So plugging in a nap around that time is likely to be good. The other time of day that I'm guessing might be appropriate to nap is around the hottest time of day. And it's likely that the dip in alertness that we experience around lunchtime, the so-called post-lunch dip, is actually an evolutionarily conserved mechanism to help protect our bodies. What I mean by that is that our body's clocks influence how alert we feel at a given time of day, which is why if you go for 48 hours without sleeping, you don't just feel sleepier and sleepier. You have peaks and troughs, and that's because of this body clock process. Interestingly, there's a dip in alertness because of this process around the hottest time of day. And it's likely that that was to help people get out of the heat of the middle of the day in order to protect their bodies from damaging ultraviolet radiation from the sun. So the best time of day is likely something like 3 p.m., around the hottest time of day for that type of nap. And interestingly, there's been some performance profiling of ultra runners showing how their race pace changes over the course of a 24-hour day. And people do seem to slow down in the early afternoon around that time. But the other, among other factors to consider, is the temperature. And that will probably quite strongly influence when you feel a nap will be most appropriate. If you're somewhere which is breathtakingly cold, then it might be off the cards to try and sleep at night. Or if you're somewhere that's incredibly hot, then maybe trying to sleep in the middle of the day is just not going to happen. Just as two examples. So you have to be flexible in your strategy. But I think the middle of your typical sleep period and around the hottest time of day are often good times to nap. And then in terms of other things, I mentioned earlier, a sleep mask can be helpful, just having one on you, and set an alarm and make it a comprehensive alarm because you'll be really sleepy. And then finally, I mentioned that different sleep stages are important to different biological processes. And for that reason, people will often say, yeah, if you have a 90-minute nap, then you go through all the different stages of sleep and you'll experience all these different restorative benefits. But the research on exercise and napping so far has shown benefits from shorter naps than that. And I don't think that many athletes will want to have a 90 or 110-minute nap to go through all those different stages of sleep. And the other thing is that sleep architecture, so our sleep cycles that we go through, is very dynamic. And if you've been through a period of prolonged sleep deprivation, then it changes such that your body prioritizes first catching up on the deeper stage of sleep. So you might find that you almost immediately drop into so-called slow wave sleep, which is characterized by these high amplitude synchronized brain waves. And it seems to be very important to things like memory consolidation, formation of memory in the immune system. So the ability to generate antibodies, for example, but then also the recovery of certain bodily tissues, because that's the stage of sleep when your body produces most of its growth hormone, which is very important to remodeling connective tissues like tendons, etc. So I wouldn't be overly concerned about that in this particular context. And then final thing I mentioned is if you want a really strong jolt in your alertness as a result of the nap, having a caffeine nap is really handy. And I think you touched on this in the previous podcast, but the idea is just to have a small amount of caffeine minutes or seconds before you start your nap. And what you'll find is that when you nap, you pay off some of that adenosine that's accumulated previously, that pressure to sleep, which is why even a short nap can be so restorative. You can pay off the adenosine much faster than it accumulates during wakefulness. But caffeine antagonizes adenosine receptors, which means that while you've got more adenosine in your body because you've been awake for so long, because of the caffeine, that adenosine in your body can't communicate with its receptors as well. So it's as if the receptors can't hear the adenosine sound effectively because they've got earplugs in the form of caffeine.
Oh, wow.
So having some caffeine immediately before a nap, maybe something like 2 milligrams per kilo, is helpful if you need an extra jolt of alertness off the back of the nap.
Well, that's a great bit of advice, and it not something I'd have thought about really. It seems counterintuitive, banging a coffee just before you try and have a nap.
Yeah, it's because of the fact that caffeine's not metabolized automatically. So if you take in caffeine, then it takes something like 45 minutes to an hour for it to reach peak concentrations in your blood. So if you take the caffeine and then you have a 20-minute nap, then by the time that you're awake 25 minutes after taking the caffeine, the caffeine is still accumulating in your blood. It hasn't really reached a threshold level in the brain yet at which to have those effects. And if you've got all of that sleep pressure from the extended wakefulness and all the activity previously, then you shouldn't be concerned about the caffeine disrupting your nap.
Fair point. Well, yeah, excellent advice. Thanks very much, Greg. I'm going to have to go back and listen to this one over again just to pick up on everything that came up in this, because there's just tons of information. But yeah, I really appreciate you stopping by and telling us all this today. There's been a tremendous amount to learn.
Pleasure. Sorry, I really go off on one sometimes.
Greg, I don't think that's a problem at all. I'm not sure ultimately if anyone comes to this podcast to listen to me speaking, and if we've got someone with the amount of knowledge in their head that you've got, then let's get as much out of it as possible, and we have certainly done that today. And we're going to have you back on, because I've still got tons of questions written on here that we didn't even get to today, and there's tons more to talk about as well. So, if you'd be happy to be back, of course.
Yeah, of course.
Excellent. Well, look, Greg, once again, thanks very much for chatting to us today. I think this has been really useful and really timely too, to be talking about, sleep and the importance of it at a time like this. So yeah, thank you, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Pleasure. Thanks, Will.